Alrighty, so it's time to get started with the final section of Yeshayahu. Tonight, what we're going to be focusing on is a unit of prakim, which deal with Yeshayahu's prophecies to the rest of the world, right? He has many prophecies that directly talk to the Jewish people, but tonight I want to focus on prophecies that he addressed internationally to other nations of the world. And while there are a number of nations in these prakim, Moab, Plishtim, Cushites, Bavel, Ashur, Mitzrayim, like there's many of them, we're going to focus on two of them. One of them is Bavel, the first one, and that's the longest. It's the opening Masa, as it's called, opening Nevuah. And then we'll also briefly look at the one from on Egypt, on Mitzrayim. So those are the two that we'll focus on. And I think as we learn through this, we'll try to kind of pull out some specific details that Yeshayahu is claiming to describe these nations and their downfall, but also extrapolate from the text itself much more universal themes, right? Because on the one hand, he's going to be talking about Bavel, he's going to be talking about Mitzrayim, but it's not just about them. Really, you can take out and glean from these texts kind of universal themes about kind of what causes the downfall of empires, whether it's corruption, whether it's immorality, and where God's role is in all of this. So that's what we'll focus on this evening. So I want us to think about it on two planes, both on the very specific and also on the kind of much larger theme as well. I want to open with a question though, and really feel free to use the chat or to raise your hand to answer some of these questions. Why is Yeshayahu the prophet who more than any of the other prophets spends a significant chunk of the Sefer talking about other nations, right? The nations I listed. He spends about 10 prakim of a 66 chapter book. That's almost 1/6 of the book. Why more than Yirmiyahu, more than Yecheskel, more than Amos, more than Zechariah does he spend so much time on the international? Please feel free to throw out some suggestions. I'm curious to hear some thoughts. Any thoughts in the chat? Or if you want, raise your hand and I'll call on you. You can also probably wave your hands in the screen and I'll find you. The Falks? You're good? Okay. Alrighty, so I'll just give you a couple of examples as perhaps why this is the case, some details that might help us. One is that Yeshayahu is the first of the major prophets that is living through an extremely tumultuous time where the independence of the Jewish entity, Judah, essentially the remnant, and Israel in the north, are actually finding themselves in a situation where they may cease to exist. So at that point, Yeshayahu has to focus his energies not only internally, but externally. And Israel is always obviously situated between massive empires, but up until this point, the major focus has been on Mitzrayim, right? We came from Mitzrayim, but there's always been a little bit of a less of a focus on the north and the east. But for the first time in Jewish history, there's a massive empire in the north, namely Assyria, Ashur, and that's going to be a major player. So one reason is just literally the time period in which Isaiah finds himself was during a very tumultuous period. I think another reason Yeshayahu focuses so heavily on the international is because if you recall, Isaiah lived and breathed in the palace, right? He was very close with the Melucha, with the kingship, with the kingdom. So he not only is giving prophecies about the very particular Jewish focus, but he's also thinking about what the kings are thinking about. Because remember, he was an advisor to the kings as well. So he's thinking internationally as well. So these are perhaps a few reasons why he focuses so heavily on the international. Because remember, by the time Jeremiah comes about, all we have left is Judah, and it's just Judah and Babylonia. Ezekiel's already in the exile. They have a little bit of a focus as the Daniel, but Yeshayahu more so than any other prophet. Okay, so I want to now turn our focus to the first of the prophecies that we'll spend about 25 to 30 minutes focusing on, and then we'll move on to the second prophecy. The first one is called Masa Bavel. It's the Babylonian prophecy, And I want to open up with a couple of questions. And what I want to do tonight a little bit is spend a little bit more time in the text, because there's some really interesting pieces that I want us to pick up on. I'm going to post the source sheet in the chat in case you have not already received it, and we'll go from there. Okay, it's posted in the chat if you don't already have it, and I'll pull up my screen. Okay, so the psukim open up, Masa Bavel Asher Chaza Yeshayahu ben Amoz. This is the opening Masa, the opening prophecy. The word Masa is already striking. What does the word Masa mean? How is it translated here? Masa is like a burden. You carry something. It's a burden. But Masa is also from the word to lift up. So when a prophet raises up his voice, Nisa, he raises up a voice of prophecy. So this is going to be a prophecy on Babylonia that Yeshayahu ben Amoz gave. There's one major issue, and I think some of you who are perhaps aware of some of the interesting historical pieces here. When did Yeshayahu live, and what empire did he not see essentially get to its prime? I see Ira Tokayer is smiling. Right, Babylonia. Remember, Isaiah lives through the Assyrian assault. Babylonia conquers Assyria. And I'm going to stop the share for just a moment. Babylonia conquers Assyria, but that happens nearly a century after Isaiah's death. So on the one hand, you could say, well, it's a prophecy, right? He's prophesizing about the future. He doesn't have to have lived through Bavel. He may not even know a Babylonian, but nevertheless, he can certainly give prophecy about something that will happen in the future. And that's one approach, and many Meforshim take that approach and are sensitive to the notion that Bavel is much later. However, there is another approach, which certainly finds itself more in the academic circles today, which is to look at this nevuah and say, well, maybe it's not really about Babylonia, right? It opens with the words Bavel, but we're going to see a number of clues that might point us in a very different direction. Not Bavel, but who's the major player during the time of Yeshayahu? Assyria, Ashur. So what I want to show you as we go through a couple sources in the two prakim this evening is sources that on the one hand will point towards Babylonia, a very future-oriented prophecy, and one is going to point towards Assyria, very kind of here and now. So I want to point out some of those as we go along. And you'll see some of the interesting, very nuanced technical details here. So the second pasuk says, Har al har nishbes unes, talking to the prophet on a high mountain, raise your flag, raise your symbol, harimu kol lahem, speak out to the Babylonian people, hanifu yad v'yavo pitchen divim, right? Let the elders, let the people who run the government essentially understand what you're about to tell them. Anybody know something about the geography of Babylonia? Ancient Babylonia, what's it situated between? You can feel free to use the chat. What's it situated between? Two major rivers, the Euphrates and the Tigris. And what is it famous for? It's flat. It's a valley, right? The borders have mountains, but there are almost no mountains on the actual region itself where the major capitals were. So what's interesting to note is some scholars will note, what kind of mountain are we talking about? However, if you look at Assyria, the major capital of Assyria was all the way in modern northern day Iraq, which at one point eventually became Nineveh, which is Mosul. But there was another palace about 20 miles away from that, which are actually situated between massive mountains. So it makes a lot more sense. Verse 2, you stand on a mountain and you speak down to the people, as opposed to Babylonia, which was really no mountains really in the immediate region. So that's really one interesting clue that people talk about from the historical perspective. Okay, so moving along here, he's now going to speak to the people of Bavel. So we're going to jump to verse number 5. So what's going to happen? The end of Bavel is coming. Ba'im me'eretz mirchak mikzeh shamayim Hashem uchlei za'amo lechabel kol haaretz. People from far away are coming to destroy either Babylonia or Ashur. And they're coming from very far away. Verse number 6, Helilu ki karov yom Hashem. The day of Hashem is coming. And we know what a day of Hashem means. The day of Hashem means a day of vengeance, a day when something bad is going to happen to your nation. And we have this really interesting imagery of the hearts of the people, the cholevav enoshi mas, melting. The hearts of the people are melting out of fear. We see this a little bit in Az Yashir as well. And so what's going to happen? The people are going to look, verse number 8, nivhalu, and there's a very interesting trope on here, nivhalu, it's people are going to be so scared and so frightened, sirim v'chavalim yochezun chayoledai yichilun. People are going to be screaming like women in labor. So we actually have a number of times throughout these prophecies where assaults on nations and kingdoms are using imagery of either women in labor or women in fear because women didn't serve in the army, right? So they were the most vulnerable in society. So we see that happen a couple times. Ish el ra'eu yitamahu, people are going to be scared of the future and to see what will come. So that's the first opening paragraph. And this is actually how most of the paragraphs of most of the prophecies open. They open with some sort of mighty image of people being scared because an army is going to come through and take over their land. But as of now, we are going to, we're going to focus now on a second piece, which is the piece about the theology behind the destruction of a nation. Just by the way, when it comes to unmuting, so unfortunately, because of extra kind of security precautions we have to take, if you want to chime in, either use the chat or just raise your hand on the function and I'll unmute you. So that's how we'll have to do it this evening. Okay, so the second part I want to look at, it comes up in a couple of different places when it comes to the prophecies of the great nations, and it focuses on the distinction between earth and heaven. Whenever we think about the downfall of any nation in a theological terms, so we think about the land itself, where people live, where the kings, mortal kings live, but we also think about it from the constellations, because all these nations believed in the various constellations and what that meant for their leadership. Right? We believe that we're above that, but the nations saw themselves through the eyes of the constellations. So that's what I want to show you in this next piece right here. It says the following. The stars of heaven and the constellations will not give light, right? A bad day is coming where essentially astrology is against us. It's going to be dark. There's going to be no light. It's going to be total darkness. Thinking about this week's Parsha, Choshech, total darkness. I will visit evilness on the Tevel. Tevel is like the earth. And I will give punishment for their sins. And I will cause the arrogance of the proud to cease. So whether we're talking about Ashur or Bavel, we're talking about the destruction of the kingdoms, in essence, from the perspective of the divine. And this is where things get scary for the destruction of a nation. And this is kind of the language and the themes that come through a lot of these prophecies. Verse 12. What does this mean? Okir enosh mipaz ve'adam mikatem ofir. I will make man more rare than fine gold, even man more rare than the gold of Ophir. Meaning, men are more rare than gold. What does that mean? Any thoughts on that? What does that mean that man becomes more rare than gold? Feel free to raise your hand or wave. Yes. You're still muted, Bernie. Just click the button.
There'll be destruction, and Sherita Pleita will be fewer people.
Exactly, and so it's going to be hard to find. It's going to be hard to find people. Essentially, gold is rare. It's going to be rare to find a living person in the realm because so many people have been destroyed by the destruction that will be coming. And what's interesting to note here in verse number 13 and 14 is the description essentially of the the dissolution, essentially the destruction of cities, right? People come into cities in order to do business for extra protection. But when civilizations are turned upside down, urban areas become the worst place to live. It's much safer to find a village and to hide out. So we have the description in verse number 14 of people kind of running away like sheep out of the city. So we have an interesting description there as well. But I want to jump to verse number 17 for a moment. We have another interesting clue. Who are we talking about here? Hinani me'ir alehem. On the Babylonians or the Assyrians, I'm going to throw who? Madai. Who are the Madais? Who are the Medes? Right, we know we're coming up to Purim, Parasu Madai. So Madai is a nation, yes? Madai is a nation that will famously fight Babylonia, right? It goes Bavel, and then following Bavel will be Paras and Madai. So this might be a clue to talking about the Babylonians, right? So we seem to have this like back and forth. We're like, are we talking about the Babylonians or are we talking about the Assyrians? From a historical perspective, it's interesting. Perhaps from a moral perspective, it might not matter. But I want to show you a couple more clues as we go along and then look at some of the moral dimensions that are important here as well. So the psukim continue in verse number 19. V'haita Bavel, again, Bavel specifically, tzvi mamlachot. It was the glory of the kingdoms, Tiferet Gaon Kastim, of the Castians. The Castians were the individuals who lived in Bavel, and Bavel became the empire that essentially are the Kastim. If you're going to describe a nation as being totally destroyed, the best kind of origin story is to describe them as Stom and Amorah, because Stom and Amorah essentially are the beginning people who are destroyed by Hashem. So what we see here is a destruction that is brought about clearly by Hashem. Okay. Lo teshiv lanetzach v'lo tishkon ador dor. Right? It will be laid to siege and destroyed. No one will ever inhabit the land ever again, or at least for many years. Just want to look at a few other verses before we turn to a second theme here. Animals will only reside there. It will be filled with animals because nobody will live there. Wild dogs will take residence in that area. So we have a very similar description here as we do for many other destroyed civilizations, but you also notice the notion of animals taking over. Famously, we have the Medrash about the fox and Harabai. When something is destroyed and people can't live there anymore, especially cities, animals take over. So that seems to be the major description when it comes to a destruction of a civilization. But up until now, we don't know why it's being destroyed. Right? It talks about the avon, the sin of the Rishaim, but what'd they do? What is the sin of Bavel? So for that, we have to turn to the next section. And what we're going to notice and what we're going to learn is that the focus of the destruction of Bavel is the work of one individual, one man. And what's fascinating is what the psukim will display to us is that the downfall of the civilization of Bavel or Ashur, depending on which way we go, can all be traced back to the mistakes of one person. And we're going to see that. We're going to see that together. Okay. So this is we've now shifted from chapter 13 to chapter 14. And chapter 14 begins, verse number 1. Why is Bavel being destroyed? Ki yirachem Hashem et Yaakov, because God is having compassion on Jacob, on the Jews. So clearly, Bavel did something to us, so now God is taking revenge. The stranger shall join himself with them, meaning people will come and join the Jewish nation because God has remembered us. And obviously, if we're talking about Bavel, so we're talking about the return of Jews to the land of Israel 70 years after the temple's destruction. If we're talking about Ashur, we're talking about the future, right? Because Ashur exiles the 10 tribes and they either really haven't come back yet. That's the messianic vision. So either way, we're talking about a future from the moment that Isaiah is speaking. We'll see the focus on that one man in just a moment. So eventually there's going to be more destruction. And I'm going to skip down to the section that I want to focus on, which is starting with section number 4. What's going to happen? I'm going to give you a parable for the king of Babylonia. So now we're going to focus on the sins of this one individual. Right? How oppressive you were to your people. the extractness of gold, meaning essentially you stole from your people. So you did terrible things. Shavar Hashem atera she'im, God is going to break the staff of the wicked, shevet moshlim, the scepter of rulers, meaning you, the king of Bavel. And he continues, Nacha shakta kol haaretz patzchurina. What did you do, the king of Babylonia or the king of Ashur? You caused the whole earth, through your destruction, through your death, to become peaceful and scream out in joy. Meaning the death of the king of Bavel caused a celebration amongst the entirety of the world, right? Because the ruler has fallen and everyone is now celebrating because he's done terrible things to them. Who else is going to celebrate? Not only people, but famously in Tehillim, who also kind of praises Hashem, the earth. Gam beroshim samchu lecha arze Levanon. The cedars of Lebanon will praise me'az shachavta lo yaleh hakort aleinu, because he's not cutting us down anymore. And now we focus on something very different. This is one of the only times, I believe, probably a number of times, but one of the only times that we focus very heavily when it comes to a narrative, it's a poetic narrative here, about the underworld, hell, purgatory. We're going to have a number of verses that focus on what happens to someone who's Rasha after they are killed or die. Right? It's very interesting. We have Mamre Chazal about it, but we have a whole section of this parak of Tehillah, of this parak of Yeshayahu, all about it. And by the way, the Gemara picks up on this and assumes it's Nebuchadnezzar Melech Bavel, the king who destroyed the Beis HaMikdash. And he's the person we're talking about here. I want to suggest, if we're talking not about Bavel, but about Ashur, this is not my suggestion, but this is the suggestion of many scholars, that we're actually talking about a famous individual. Some of you may have learned about him, Sargon II. King Sargon II was the ruler of Assyria, of Ashur, and he lived essentially during the time of Isaiah. And famously, we'll see in a moment, there's a really interesting history about the death of Sargon II. I'm just going to show you an image of Sargon II, just so you get a taste of who this Russia was, just to see an image, just to see what he looked like. But this is an image of Sargon II at Dur Sharukin, which was his capital. It was 20 miles from Nineveh, modern-day Mosul, and this was his capital. It was abandoned after his death, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes. This is an image of him. If anybody, I'm not sure if they have this in images in New York, but I've seen them in other cities around the world. Particularly Berlin has many, as does Paris, has many parts from Babylonia, from ancient Babylonia, and this is his image. Okay, so Sargon II was the ruler who conquered much of the Near East. He conquered what's today Syria, Lebanon, southern Turkey. He eventually conquers, and his descendants eventually conquer parts of Egypt as well. But this was the king. This was who he was, and this is who he looked like. And if we're talking about Sargon II, the story is about to make a lot of sense. But let's look at the story and then plug it into his details. Let me just check the chat. Alrighty. Okay. So what happens next? Just going to scroll down. Verse number 9. We're in chapter 14, verse number 9. It's all about this one individual. Sha'ol mitachat, hell, Sha'ol, under the underworld. Just remember, we also had Shaul coming back from Sha'ol. So now we have a story about Sha'ol mitachat ragzalach likrat boecha. Right? When you died, the underworld was like, welcome. They were welcome, but they were a little frightened of you because you're very scary. Right? Everyone on earth was kind of excited that you went down there. All the kings in the underworld got up for you when you came down. Right? You're a great, great king. You're also frightening. And what do they say to you? Think about like kulam hodu v'himlichu ve'amru. Everyone says, what is verse 10? You're just like us. You're so weak that you died and ended up just like us in the underworld, right? Everyone is born and everyone dies. And he's saying, not only did you die, but you ended up in the underworld just like us, as opposed to ending up in essentially what you would call heaven, shamayim, and we'll see that actually alluded to specifically here. Yud Aleph, Hurad Sha'ol Ge'onecha, you've been brought down, Hemyat Hemyat nivalecha, your body has been destroyed. Tachtecha yutzarima umechasecha tolea, right? Worms are eating at your corpse. Ech nafalta mishamayim, how far have you fallen, literally from heaven? Because remember, if you're a god in the ancient Near East, what are you? A king, excuse me. Just gave away the answer. You're also a god, a deity. So you were considered like a constellation, and how far have you fallen that you've ended up in the underworld? Helel ben Shachar, you day of the son of the early morning, nigdata la'aretz, you've fallen down to earth. Cholesh al goyim, you played games with the nations, and now you're nothing. Yud Gimel, you thought ata amarta bilvavcha shemayim aleh, you thought you were going to be in the heavens. You thought your chair, your throne would be in the heavens, you great king. No, you're down here. You're all the way. Ach el shaol turad el yarkate bor. You're in the uttermost pit of the underworld. You're like the worst of the worst. And so they just continue. Hazeh ha'ish margis ha'aretz marish mamlacho. Right? You who made people tremble when they saw you, you're now like a laughing stock. Some tevel kamid bar v'arav haras. You destroyed civilizations. You destroyed cities. Lo fatach baita. Right? Nobody essentially wanted you, and now you are all the way down here. And look at the highlighted verses, and then I'll tie it into Ashur. These are the key verses here. Verse number 18. Kol malchei goyim kulam shachvu bichvod ish beveto. Every king of the world, right? Whether you're the king of Bavel, whether you're king of Ashur, of Mitzrayim, of Cush, Moab, Ammon, what happens to you? You get to go and die and be buried among the kings, right? For example, you go to Jerusalem, there's an area where kings get buried. And if you're a bad king, if you remember, Divrei Hayamim and parts of Malachim said you weren't buried with the kings. So what happens? You were thrown out of your grave, meaning you were not able to be buried with the kings, like an offshoot, right? Like a root. You were like a body thrown into the abyss. Lo techari tam bigvura, and this is the last verse we'll focus on for this part. You will not be joined in burial with your people, with your kings. Ki artzecha shichata. What's this punishment for? Why don't you get buried with your kings, with your people? Because you destroyed your own country. Ki artzecha shichata. You've destroyed it. Amcha harakta. You killed your own people. Lo yikareh la'olam zera meraim. The seed of evildoers will never be remembered. Okay, jumping back to Assyria. Why could this easily be Assyria, not Bavel? Sargon II, and feel free, Google this afterwards, it's well documented. Sargon II famously dies in, I believe this is year 705. He famously dies in battle in what's today northern Syria, southern Turkey, in the midst of a battle, and his body was never uncovered. His body was never taken back to the people, to the kingdom. So on the one hand, we're thinking, well, that happens, right? That happens. In the ancient Near East, that was seen as one of the worst omens possible, that your king, who's a deity's body, would not be returned to its proper burial. So much so that if you recall that image I showed you of Sargon II, so the place of his capital was abandoned after his body was taken. It's 20 miles from modern day Mosul, abandoned. They stopped using that as the capital and moved it back to Nineveh because it was seen as a terrible sign that your king would not be buried among other kings. So many scholars say this is exactly what we're talking about here. The king destroyed his nation, his body was taken, and it was seen as a terrible sign. And Yeshayahu was picking up on that. Yeshayahu was saying what happened was atrocious. And it's a sign of the wickedness of you as a person. I kind of think of this perek as like Dante's Divine Comedy, right? It's like talking about the underworld and talking about kind of the different levels of it. And he's the person who caused it. And so that's what the perek is talking about. So this is the mostly the end of the perek. There's a couple more verses. I'm not going to focus on all of them. Eventually it actually does talk a little bit about Assyria briefly. So again, we see this back and forth. But essentially, just thinking about this perek, whether it's Bavel, whether it's Ashur, it's interesting because the Assyrians sometimes refer to themselves as Babylonians. So it also could be playing off of that because the Assyrian rulers ruled over the Babylonian lands before Bavel became an empire. So the play here with Ashur and Bavel might just be like, you could say you're British, you're English, like Scottish, right? It's all kind of part of the same area, but you use different words to describe it. So that could be what's going on here. But I think what is more important than the historical questions here is what we learn from it, right? Because any nevuot that are given to us are nevuot not just for then, but for the future. And so what I think it highlights here is how a society can dissolve by more than just the action of many. It can even be the action of one. And you see that in this parak, and it's a message about what it means to take responsibility as leaders. So that's Bavel. We're gonna pause Bavel, but any questions about Bavel before we move on to Mitzrayim? Again, you can raise your hand, you can put it in the chat, you can wave your hands, whatever works for you. Okay, so let's move on. Let's move on to Mitzrayim. Okay, so before we move on to Mitzrayim, I want to show you another image here, which is going to be an image just so we understand what we're talking about here. Again, the middle, essentially a picture of the Near East from this time period. Okay, so this is the image I just want to show you. So ancient Ashur started here. Right, by the way, this is kind of ancient Babylonia. This is the seat of Bavel right here, which eventually becomes Bavel. Dur Sharukim, which is up here by Nineveh, this is the capital of Assyria up here, okay? And they conquered here and eventually conquered much of what is today the land of Israel, right? Except for Judah, right? Famously so. And also much of Egypt a little bit later. What we're now going to focus on is prior to essentially Egypt being taken over by Ashur and other kingdoms. We're going to think about Egypt both as an independent entity, but also some sort of future Egypt that gets overthrown. Again, did it happen already? I don't know. Is it a prophecy for the future? Again, I don't know. But we'll see some of the clues that the text leaves us, and we'll see a little bit more about some of the messages that the prophet is trying to deliver to us about the pitfalls that society can often fall into, right? If we focused with Bavel on perhaps the awful ruler, here we're going to focus a little bit more on the inability of rulers in plural, meaning advisors, heads of state of like little cities, for example, in an ancient civilization, and how they can cause civil war amongst themselves and cause destruction themselves. So that's going to be a little bit of a different focus when it comes to Egypt. But again, it's for Egypt, but it's also something that you can extrapolate on for other civilizations as well. So with that kind of brief introduction, I'm going to now jump into the Masa of Mitzrayim. Masa Mitzrayim. This is the prophecy of Mitzrayim, and the prophecy of Mitzrayim is mostly just parak 19. There's a couple parts in parak 20, but we're just focusing on 19. Masa Mitzrayim, hine Hashem rochev al av kol uva Mitzrayim. So what happens? Prophecy about Egypt. God is kind of above us, kind of riding up high. V'na'u elilei Mitzrayim mipanav ulevav Mitzrayim yimas bikirbo. The idols of Egypt, meaning because Egypt had many different gods, will kind of quiver before our God, Hashem. Verse number 2, V'sichsachti Mitzrayim b'Mitzrayim. What's going to happen? The Egyptians will fight each other. So what's going to happen? At some point, there's going to be a fault line drawn in ancient Egypt, or some sort of future Egypt. Civil war will break out. Egyptian versus Egyptian. V'nilchamu ish be'achi v'ish be're'ehu. Ir ba'ir mamlacha ba'mamlacha, right? Each city and each quarter, each district will fight each other. So this is a different vision of a destruction of a society. This is an internal strife. So what's going to happen? They turn to false hopes. The people don't know what to do. V'darshu el ha'ililim. They don't know who to turn to. What happens? Verse number 4. V'sikarti et Mitzrayim. I will make the Egyptians fall under the rule biyad adonim kasheh. right? They're going to fall under harsh rulers, dictators rise, umelech azim sholbam, and then a harsh strongman king will come, Nu'um ha'adon Hashem tzvakot. Meaning, once the civilization itself fights against each other for some sort of purpose within their society, whether it's they're fighting over land or they're fighting over food, what's going to happen? God's going to intervene and assure that harm's going to come their way, because what did they do when they were in pain? Who did they turn to? They turned to idols, and God's going to punish them for it. So here there's also a focus on idolatry, right? If you turn towards idolatry, the God of Israel will eventually strike back, essentially. So what's going to happen? And this obviously is very timely for all the parshiot we're reading now. V'nishtu mayim mehayam, the water will fail, meaning the main source of economy, of lifeblood for the ancient Egyptians and Egypt today is the Nile. V'nahar yecharav v'yavesh, it will dry up. If the Nile dries up, or if the Nile turns to blood like it does in our parshiot, it's done, right? Ancient Egypt cannot work. V'heznichu naharot dalu v'charvu yorei matzor, right? It will become foul. It will become disgusting. Why? We'll see in a moment. Because like anything that lives in it is going to die. Kaneh vasuf kameilu, and all of the surrounding agriculture will dry up, right? So if you make money selling any of them, we'll see in a moment, like if you make flax, if you have any vegetation, it's done. So it's important to note that the society cannot function if the Nile dries up. The question just came through: why are the Egyptians being punished for idolatry? It's a good question, right? All ancient civilizations had idolatry, right? We, the Jews, recognize God, so why should they be punished? So, on the one hand, all peoples are obliged to follow and understand that there's one God, even though they're not Jewish, right? They are supposed to have their own God. But I think what's happening here is that it's not only idolatry, but there's other pieces involved. It's where the idolatry led them, or what led them to the idolatry, right? It's going to be, we'll see, it's going to be the infighting. So perhaps if there was no civil war, but there was just idolatry, perhaps God wouldn't have sought out vengeance. So I think idolatry is often the buzzword for immorality. I think that happens a lot throughout Tanakh, and it kind of reminds me back to when Rabbi Alex Israel discussed the openings of Malachim, right? Idolatry means immorality. So essentially, that's what I think is going on here as well. Okay, so it's going to dry up, and the psukim continue that essentially the Nile dries up. We'll just jump to verse number 8. Ve'anud hadayagim, the fishers have nothing because they can't fish. So essentially, we're going to see the crippling of a society based upon one issue, which is the Nile. Right? They can't do anything now that the Nile has been dried up. And the Nile represents idolatry as well, right? It was worshipped. Uvoshu ovdei pishtim, the people who make flax are upset, as are the people who weave, etc., because they're using materials from the Nile basin. The people who create buildings along its side. So when the Nile stops working, so there's going to be things shift, things are going to crush, things are going to implode. So the entire Egyptian civilization falls apart. We here now have some really interesting historical pieces that I want to point out to you. Look at verse number 11. Ach evilim saret so'an. What's so'an? So'an's a place. Comes up a lot throughout Tanakh. What is so'an? So So'an was one of the ancient Egyptian capitals. Ancient Egypt had different capitals throughout different time periods and different kingdoms. But So'an was the kingdom, and it is used on maps today as Tanis, Tanis, which was an ancient city in Egypt. It's in Upper Egypt. So essentially, we have one of them specifically mentioned here, and we'll have a couple more as we go along. What happens? The Chochmei Yovetzei Pharaoh Eitza Nivara. They give awful, senseless counsel to the king, to Pharaoh. So it's a less of a focus on one individual. It's more about the society and especially the people surrounding the leadership. So they continue to ask, Noalu Sarei Tzoan Nisharu Sarei Nof. We have another place. The princes of Tzoan, as we just mentioned, are fools. And what happens? Nisu Sarei Nof. The people of Nof are deceived. Where is Nof? What city is Nof in ancient Egypt? It's also a city in the south. Memphis. So Memphis is Nof. Memphis is ancient, is Nof. So we have another reference to a major religious center in ancient Egypt, right? The peoples of all these major cities can't help, right? Because they're foolish, they don't have good advice. Hashem masach bekirba ruach ivim. He's caused them to be dizzy. They have no idea what they're doing. This is intense imagery here. What is ancient Egypt like? And I'll just read it in the English because the English, I think for us, is so much more powerful because it's a little harder in the Hebrew. As a drunken man staggereth in his vomit. Right? What is ancient Egypt at this point? They're like fools coming out of a bar at 3 o'clock in the morning, right? They have no idea what they're doing. The rulers of all the major cities are totally lost in abyss. And that is how a civilization falls apart. That's when there's going to be civil war. That's when the people are being failed by their leadership. So they have no idea what to do anymore. And again, we have this imagery using the metaphor of a woman, and here it is certainly not imagery that one would write, I think, in 2021, but I think we still understand what they're getting at here. Bayomahu ye Mitzrayim kanashim. Egypt will be like women. What's the reference here to? Because women didn't fight in battle, so v'charadu pachad mipnei trufat yad Hashem tzvakot, right? They were fearful because they were afraid of who was going to attack them. Asher hu meinif alav. So essentially, the prophet is saying ancient Egypt will be brought down to a situation where they can't defend themselves. And obviously, also in ancient Egypt, the advisors that we were referring to were male. So we saw this language, if you remember, back in Shirat Devorah, right? Devorah, who's obviously famously the prophetess and the Shofetet for ancient Israel. When they have Shirat Devorah, they actually play on the fact that she was a woman and that she was much better than all the men, meaning, and they play that out in Shirat Devorah. So we see that somewhat here as well. Okay, I want to focus now, just for a few moments, on a really interesting and fascinating piece that'll come up in a moment, which is both about history, but also kind of an interesting etymological discussion that comes out of the next couple of verses. What's going to happen? So, the land of Judah will become a terror to Egypt. Wait, what's happening here? Are we attacking Egypt? Why is Egypt afraid? So you might say maybe this is a prophecy about 67. Like, who knows? Right? What's going on here? So ancient Egypt or modern Egypt, future Egypt is scared of Judah. So why? So it would seem because, and it says Mipnat Sat Hashem Tzvakot. Why are they afraid of us? Because they will recognize that everything that's happening to them is because of our God, meaning our Hashem is almighty, and he causes things to happen. So people become afraid of us because they understand that we worship the true God. Bayomahu, what's going to happen on one of these days? Bayomahu, who knows? Bayomahu, when will Bayomahu take place? I don't know. Yihiyu chamesh arim be'eretz Mitzrayim, 5 major cities. Again, it doesn't list them, but I could imagine them being, for example, Nof, that we just said, Memphis. It could be a number of other ones that we'll see in a moment. And I'll show you a map in just a minute. Be'eretz Mitzrayim, midabrot sfat Canaan. They're going to speak Canaanite. What? Why are they speaking Canaanite? Any ideas? Why they don't speak Canaanite in ancient Egypt or future Egypt? What is Canaanite? Bernie. Just click the unmute button. I just
there was some historical view that there were Canaanites in the Jewish territory, and they got themselves loyalty to the Jews, basically, after the Jews showed their superiority, and they went back to Egypt. They fled to Egypt. So they brought with them, a knowledge of Hebrew at the time.
Yeah. So one could be that, like Bertie's saying, you have these kind of refugees fleeing to Egypt and kind of influencing Egyptian society. Any other thoughts? So I don't think I don't have the proper answer here. Again, we're talking prophecy here, so there is a bit of guessing here. But one other way to look at it is to say that the people will try to mimic the people who are the nation of God. Meaning, if they fear us, so often when you look up to a nation, you also fear them, right? They're the most powerful, right? So people want to a little bit learn how to deal with that. So there's a reason people speak English. There's a reason people want to know Chinese, right? People want to know languages that are heavily influenced or heavily allow you to do business with them to ensure that you're secure and safe. So that could be another reason. But I think that's also similar to what Bernie was saying, is you have this influence from the outside. So that's one reason. And the pasuk continues here, and I'll show you the pasuk, and then I'll pull up the map to show you something interesting. V'nishba'ot laHashem tzvakot, right? They will swear to Hashem, Ir haHeres ye'amer le'echat. The city of Heres, destruction, right? Heres means destruction. Ye'amer le'echat will be one of them. Okay, so it doesn't tell us what the 5 cities are, but it says one of them is going to be Ir haHeres, the city of destruction. It sounds pretty ominous. City of destruction. However, if you look at some of the scholarship on this, Robert Alter is one of them. Heres, which means destruction, often in ancient Tanakh, a hey and a chet can often be interchangeable depending on what you're talking about, a hey and a chet. And Ir ha-cheres, chet resh samet, sin. What is cheres? It's clay, right? A clay cheres is a utensil. But Ir ha-cheres, cheres in 2 other places in Tanakh does not mean a clay earthen vessel, earthenware. Rather, it's a reference to what causes something to be earthenware, which is that it is exposed to heat. Cheres is a synonym for shemesh. That was like a little bit of a train of thought. Heres really might be cheres, and cheres in Tanakh means shemesh or sun. It's in a couple of places, and I see Eli Strauss just wrote, wait, isn't there a city in ancient Egypt called Horus? So exactly, and that name actually, that name is another reference. It doesn't literally mean sun, but it is a reference in the Greek. That was the name of a city in ancient Greece for Egypt. Horus was the Greek name, one of the names of the gods that they assigned to the city. But another name, it was called Horus, but it had another name. They worship the sun exactly. What's the other name? This one is a little bit, what's the other name? Put it in the chat, or very similar to Sun City. What's the other one? Close. Another one. Starts with an H also. Heliopolis. So Helio is sun, Polos is city. So the city of, exactly, Miriam, thank you, exactly. So the historical piece here, which might be going on, is it's called the city of Heres because it's a city of sun, Heres. And the god in ancient Egypt was the god of Ra, which was the sun god, or he was called in Tanakh the god of On, Aleph Vav Nun, which is another name for him. So it's god of Ra or On in Hebrew, or Avon in Hebrew. And Heliopolis and Horus are essentially synonymous, just different time periods called it different things. It's a city that worshiped the sun god. So that could be what's going on here. And I wanted to show you this map, which will essentially show us what we're talking about here. We have a bunch of different cities in ancient Egypt. And I wanted to show you a bunch, like 3 of them are mentioned just in this one prophecy. We have Memphis mentioned, Nof, Tanis is mentioned in this one. Heliopolis is mentioned, right? So 3 major Egyptian cities are mentioned in this one prophecy. And there could be a couple other allusions as well. So you kind of just see how that plays out in the prophecy itself. Okay, so what do? These cities eventually come together, and the prophecy will essentially end, and we'll close up with the prophecy in just a moment. Ends with the people, what do? Bayomahu yeh mizbeach laHashem. Once they realize that the God of Israel is the true God and they want to speak Canaanite, similar language to what we speak, they build mizbachot laHashem, they build altars to God, they become monotheists. B'toch Eretz Mitraim, and they also put one on the border Just like, remember Israel, the northern tribes put idols on the northern and southern borders. So you put a mizbeach on your border because that says you're about to enter into a monotheistic land. V'noda Hashem leMitzrayim, the Egyptians know who we are. V'yadu Mitzrayim et Hashem bayomahu. Egypt will know us. Now, you could say that, well, maybe this has already happened, right? You could argue, and again, I'm not a prophet, so I can't actually tell you what this is truly about. But Egypt's monotheists, right? Egypt is generally speaking a Muslim country, right? Muslims are monotheists, so you could say this already happened. Again, I don't know, but you could say that could be a description. And the most shocking verse of all is these three verses. Bayomahu tiyeh mesilah Mitzrayim Ashura. There's going to be a path, a highway from Egypt to Assyria, south to north. Egyptians will go to Assyria. Assyrians will go to Egypt. Ve'avdu Mitzrayim et Ashur. And the Egyptians shall worship with the Assyrians. Who? God, our God. Right? It's a prophetic vision of the two major players in ancient Near East worshiping Hashem. You can imagine Isaiah during a time where he's being crushed, defeated by these countries. To talk about a day where they will worship our God is incredible. Bayomahu ye Yisrael shalishiyah. Israel will be essentially like the third wheel of a chariot, right? You have these two chariot, you have two wheels of a chariot, you have that third wheel in the back, the tricycle, and we're essentially the middle path between these two extremes. And the last verse, Hasher bercho Hashem tzvakot lemor, Baruch Ami, blessed be my nation. What's the next word? Verse number 25. Mitzrayim. Umasei adai Ashur v'nachalato Yisrael. Shocking. God is blessing his nation, Egypt, and his Masei adai Ashur. Never do we see this. Who is described as my nation, my people? We are my people. It's incredible. Rashi is so perturbed by these languages. He reinterprets the Pshat to essentially say it's talking about the Jews exiled in these locations. It's not really the Pshat here, I think. Almost all the other Mefarshim say, no, it's actually talking about a time where they will recognize God. And once you recognize God, you also are deserving of the title of my people, which is really a beautiful, incredible prophetic vision that once all the other nations recognize God, we'll get to a point where people focus on Hashem as well. What I'm going to do now is we focused on these two pieces. And Egypt, obviously, you can talk about the historical piece, and you can talk about the history here. But again, I think you can extrapolate from these Egyptian texts, from this text about Egypt, onto other nations, right? When people fight against each other, when bad advice is given by advisors, when there's civil war between different city-states essentially within a civilization, they fall apart. However, the remedy, at least through the prophet, is the knowledge of God, right? If we can understand that there's an individual truth from where everything emerges, then that's one way to solve it, right? There's famously the Sheva Mitzvos B'nai Noach, which establishes that we have to have proper civility, proper laws. And so if you recognize God, you essentially bow your head towards a much more moral society. So that could be alluded to in the texts as well, and I think goes well beyond ancient Egypt. At this point, it's five of. I want to turn to the Hadron, and a huge milestone to everyone who completed. And I'm happy to stick around afterwards, but I want to make sure people have time to jump off and join the Yoval program, which will start in about 5 or 6 minutes. So I'm going to turn over to the Hadron. Let me just okay, one moment. Okay, first I want to just show you all the Hardy Mazel Tov, and wrong, 1 second. Sorry, 1 second. And I want to just, thank everyone for really their commitment. I know this was a lot harder than our previous texts, and it really speaks volumes for those of you. And again, we apologize for those who may have been omitted. We try our best. If you register, your name should be on here, but sometimes registrations come in late. But we want to say a Mazel Tov on completing Sefer Yeshayahu. Now I'll turn the first one over to Henry.
Hadron Allah Sefer Yeshayahu v'Hadron Allah. Daitach Sefer Yeshayahu v'Daitach Alon. Lo Sinashe Minach Sefer Yeshayahu v'Lo Sinashe Minon. Lo Malbal Al Dein Bo Bamodasi. Hadron alach Sefer Yeshayahu Hadron alach. Daitan alach Sefer Yeshayahu Daitach Alon. Lo Snashe Minach Sefer Yeshayahu Snashe Minan. Lo Bama Hadem Lo Bama Dasi. Hadron alach Sefer Yeshayahu Hadron Alon. Daitach alach Sefer Yeshayahu Daitach Alon. Lo Snashe Minach Sefer Yeshayahu Snashe Minan. Lo Bama Hadem Lo Bama Dasi. Yiratzon v'necha Adonai Elohim Eloheinu shehei torascha emun asim bo mazeh u'shehei imanu lo'olam haba Chanina bar Papa, Rami bar Papa, Nachman bar Papa, Achai bar Papa, Abba bar Papa, Rafram bar Papa, Rachish bar Papa, Surcha bar Papa, Ada bar Papa, Daru bar Papa.
Harev na Adonai Eloheinu et yirei toratcha befinu v'fiot amcha beit Yisrael v'hiniyeh anachnu kulanu v'tziatzeinu v'tziatzei amcha beit Yisrael kulanu yodei shemecha v'lomdei toratcha me'oivai techakmenu mitzvotecha ki le'olam hi li yehi libi tamim mechukecha lema'an lo evosh le'olam lo eshkach bekugecha kivam chitani baruch atah Adonai lamdeni chukecha.
Amen.
Odim anachnu lefanecha Adonai Eloheinu v'Elohei Avotenu shesamtech alkeinu miyoshvei beis hamedrash v'lo samtech alkeinu miyoshvei kranot she'anu mashkimim v'heim mashkimim anu mashkimim l'divrei Torah v'heim mashkimim l'divar metelim anu amelim v'heim amelim anu amelim mekablim schar v'heim amelim v'eina mekablim schar anu ratzim v'heim ratzim anu ratzim l'chayei olam haba v'heim ratzim l'ver shachat shne'amar ve'ata Elohim toridem l'ver shachat Anshe damim umirma lo yechatzu yemehem v'ani aftach bach. Yehi ratzonu lefanecha Adonai Elohai kashem shezratani l'sayim Sefer Yeshayahu ken ta'azreinu lahatchil masechtot usfar macherim l'saymam. Lilmod u'lalamed lishmor v'lasod u'lakayim et kol divrei Talmud Toratcha b'yava. Uzchut kol hatanayim ve'amoraim v'talmidei chachamim yamod li u'lezari shelo tamush haTorah mipi u'mipi zari ad olam. V'yitkayem bi b'yithalechecha tanche otach b'shopcha tishmor alecha v'hakitzota hi tesichecha kivi yirbu yamecha v'yosifu l'cha shnot chayim orech yamim b'mina b'smala usher v'chavod Adonai oz le'amo yitain Adonai yivarech et amo v'shalom. Mazel tov to one and to all. I wanted to show you our flyer, which we are just about to get the dates officially down for the teaching. We're starting January 31st, which is not this coming Sunday. We're taking 1 week off. So for those of you who may have been a little behind in Yeshayahu, it's kind of like good time to catch up. And then we're starting January 31st, and we'll go until essentially a week before Pesach. We're going to have 7 classes. And we just were figuring out 1 or 2 of the details, but probably by Tuesday, we'll have the exact breakdown. We're going to be covering between 6 and 7 chapters a week. And again, we'll try to tell you, we're going to go in chronological order this time, meaning order of the prakim, because it's much more easy to follow than Sefer Yeshayahu. And we hope that this will kind of be a wonderful way to continue your learning. So at this point, feel free to jump off. If you want to jump off to the Baval program, I'm happy to stick around for those of you who have any more questions or comments.
Thank you, Rabbi Buechler. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. If you have any questions or comments, obviously feel free to raise your hand or to put it in the chat.